There are moments in history when the world seems to pause, just long enough for a human being to place a foot where no one has stepped for centuries. And suddenly, the past exhales. It exhales through stone, through earth, through cold mountain air, as if a forgotten age has been waiting patiently for someone brave or foolish enough to pull back the veil of time. It is in those rare, fragile instants that the fabric between the living and the lost becomes thin. And a single view, a single discovery, can reorder everything we think we know about civilization, about endurance, about what it means for a culture to rise, to flourish, and to vanish. The year was 1911. The world was marching toward the fever of modernity. Airplanes, telegraphs, engines roaring into a new mechanical age. Nations were shaking off the dust of old empires, inventing themselves anew. Yet, as humanity rushed forward, a handful of explorers felt an irresistible pull backward, toward the shadows of history, toward the places not yet mapped or categorized, where the earth still held secrets too vast, too sacred, too stubborn to surrender easily. High in the Peruvian Andes, clouds moved like slow, pale creatures drifting across the jagged spine of the mountains. The air was thin enough to steal breath, sharp enough to sting the lungs. Forests clung to cliff sides like ancient guardians, their roots gripping rock older than recorded memory. And cutting through this labyrinth of stone and foliage was a narrow path, a mere ghost of a trail, nowhere near the domain of the comfortable or the safe. A small group of men moved along this path, each step echoing not into the valley below, but forward into history. They could not have known it then, but the ground beneath their boots was trembling with centuries of stories buried beneath layers of silence and moss. Ahead of them, just beyond the next rise, the world was preparing to reveal a secret it had withheld from humanity for over 400 years. To those men, it was merely another bend in the trail, another clearing of vines, another struggle upward through mud and stone. But to time itself, this was the moment it had been rehearsing since the Inca Empire fell. The moment a forgotten city would breathe again. For hours they climbed higher, cutting through the thick green curtain of the rainforest. Mists rolled around them, swallowing and releasing shapes like shifting illusions. There were ruins scattered throughout the Andes, crumbled walls, fragments of staircases leading nowhere, but nothing prepared them for what waited ahead. Then, in a single astonishing moment, the forest parted, and the world changed. Where minutes earlier, there had been nothing but choking vines, dripping leaves, and the damp perfume of the jungle, there now rose a wall. No, not a wall, but a declaration carved in stone. Granite blocks, polished by the touch of centuries, fitted so perfectly together that not even a blade of grass could slip between them. Their edges caught the dull light filtering through the clouds, making them appear impossibly smooth, almost luminous, like the bones of a sleeping titan. The men froze. Before them stretched terraces etched into the mountainside, forming steps that ascended as though drawn upward by the hands of gods. Buildings crowned the upper ridges, their windows staring blindly into the sky. Pathways curved, intersected, and disappeared into the mist, like arteries of a vanished city still pulsing with the faintest memory of life. It was not a ruin overtaken by chaos. It was a masterpiece hidden by nature, a city not destroyed, simply removed from the world. For generations, local farmers had whispered its name, Machu Picchu, but no map marked it. No conquistador had chronicled it. No historian had described it. It was as though the city had been built in defiance of time, and then willingly stepped out of history the moment its builders disappeared. The explorers walked forward slowly, reverently, like intruders in a cathedral. Every stone, every stair, Every shadow seems to vibrate with a presence too grand, too deliberate to belong to the wilderness. This was not an outpost, not a village. This was something else, something royal, something sacred. And that was when the questions began. Why had the people who built this place walked away? Why had they left their temples, their terraces, their fountains, their watchtowers, left everything without burning it, without sealing it, without destroying it to keep it from the hands of invaders? Who were they, these architects of the clouds? What kind of civilization could lift a city into the sky and anchor it into the bones of a mountain? What vision, what belief, what force of will allowed human beings to carve permanence out of cliffs and mist? The explorers had not simply found a city. They had opened a wound in time, because Machu Picchu was not merely abandoned, it was orphaned, left intact, left proud, left waiting. Stones that should have collapsed still stood with impossible precision. Terraces that should have eroded held their lines like disciplined soldiers. Water channels cut through bedrock centuries ago still carried the mountain's lifeblood in thin, disciplined streams. It was as if the city had been preserved not by chance, but by intention, like a message sent across centuries, sealed inside a mountain, awaiting the moment someone would arrive to unseal it. But beneath the awe, beneath the beauty, beneath the grandeur, an unease simmered. What catastrophe drives a people to walk away from paradise? Why was there no record, no insight, no final testimony explaining the silence that swallowed this world? Civilizations do not vanish quietly. Empires do not yield without scars. A city like Machu Picchu, a jewel crafted by thousands of hands, a sanctuary of stone lifted into the heavens, does not simply fade because its builders grew tired. History is full of stories of destruction, the fires of Rome, the floodplains of Sumer, the collapsing palaces of Angkor. But this was different. Machu Picchu showed no burns, no weapon marks, no mass graves. The city was not murdered. It was abandoned. And the reason for that abandonment has haunted historians for more than a century. What invisible force tore apart the empire that built this sanctuary? What unseen enemy uprooted a civilization of 12 million people? What chain of events could demolish the greatest power in the Andes and leave its crown jewel untouched? That is the mystery. Not merely how Machu Picchu was built, though that alone defies belief. The true mystery is why it still stands. And so, before we descend into the deeper labyrinth of the Inca world, before we walk into the halls of their kings, trace the veins of their roads, feel the thunder of their armies, or witness the unraveling of their empire, let us pause here, on this mountain. Let us stand with those explorers on the day the earth revealed a memory it had hidden for centuries. Let us acknowledge that some cities are not lost. They are waiting, waiting for eyes that can see them, waiting for hands that can translate their silence, waiting for a world that is finally prepared to ask the right questions. And now, as we step into the shadows and lights of this extraordinary civilization, as we unravel the rise and fall of an empire built in the realm of the clouds, allow me to welcome you. This is Empires Historical, and today we begin a journey into the heart of a city that refused to die. Before we continue, if you feel the pull of this story, if the mystery of Machu Picchu is already tugging at something deep inside you, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support gives us the strength and motivation to keep bringing these lost worlds back to life, one forgotten empire at a time. But before we journey deeper, before we attempt to resurrect the age when kings walked these terraces and priests read the breath of the mountains, there is something essential we must confront. No city, no monument, no empire appears in isolation. Machu Picchu is not merely a place, it is a consequence. a consequence of belief, of ambition, of fear, and of a worldview so radically different from our own that even now, over a century after its rediscovery, it resists simple explanation. To stand before those terraces is to face a civilization that measured time not in years, but in cycles, that measured wealth not in gold, but in labor, that measured power not by conquest alone, but by the ability to bend the landscape itself into harmony with human will. Every stone that rises here, every angle of every wall, carries a philosophy, an understanding of the world that did not separate the divine from the natural, nor the natural from the human. For the Inca, to build was to worship. To carve stone was to speak with the earth. To raise a city into the sky was to acknowledge the sacred geometry of existence itself. And perhaps that is why this place could not be erased, because it was not merely engineered, it was consecrated. Yet even consecration cannot stop the march of oblivion. It cannot halt disease. It cannot silence betrayal. It cannot shield an empire when its own foundation begins to fracture. Somewhere beyond this mountain ridge, beyond the clouds, drifting like wandering spirits, the forces that would one day extinguish the Inca flame were already awakening. Forces born not in the Andes, but across oceans, shaped by hunger and steel, driven by a worldview in which the sacred was secondary to the profitable, in which the unknown was not respected, but consumed. And so, when you look at Machu Picchu today, silent, breathless, suspended between earth and sky, you are not just looking at a city. You are looking at an echo vibrating between two worlds. The world that built it, and the world that destroyed the builders. One world that believed in the living essence of stone, and another that believed in the living power of empire. The collision of those worlds was inevitable and devastating and final. But that collision is not our destination, not yet. For before we witness the unraveling, we must understand the weaving. Before we watch the empire fall, we must see how it rose. How it transformed hunger into strategy, isolation into ingenuity, violence into order, and order into a vision so expansive that it reshaped nearly every landscape it touched. Only then will the silence of Machu Picchu make sense. Only then will its terraces speak. Only then will the stones whisper the story they have held for centuries. A story of kings, of gods, of fragile triumphs, and of the thin line between immortality and oblivion. So stay with me. Walk with me into the thin air of these mountains. Let us uncover not just what the Inca built, but why they believed it would endure. And let us face the question that lingers in every ruin, in every fallen empire, in every stone that refuses to crumble. What truly destroys a civilization? If you have not yet subscribed, I invite you again. Join us. The journey ahead will be long, unsettling, beautiful, and unforgettable. And together, we will follow the road the Inca once carved across the spine of a continent, all the way to the heart of their greatest mystery. To understand Machu Picchu, one must first understand the place that shaped it, the Andes. A mountain range not merely long, but endless, not merely tall, but primordial, like the backbone of a continent exposed to the sky. 7,000 kilometers of fractured stone and trembling earth, rising and falling like the ribs of an ancient titan asleep beneath the skin of South America. Here, nature is not a backdrop. Here, nature is the first empire. And long before the Inca carved cities into the clouds, long before humans learned how to cling to these impossible slopes, the Andes had already declared their terms. Nothing survives here by accident. Stand among these mountains long enough, and you feel it. The scale, the silence, the cold, breath slipping down from peaks where oxygen thins and the world narrows to the width of a heartbeat. A sunlit valley may warm you for a moment, but one turn of the wind brings winter crashing down in white avalanches. Rivers claw their way through gorges, violent and impatient, as if trying to escape the very mountains that gave them life. Life in the Andes is a negotiation with danger, every single day. To the east, the Amazon rises like a green ocean, humid, feverish, alive with pulses of creation and destruction. Its canopy hides things that glow, things that slither, things that have no names because no human has ever lived long enough to name them. The rainforest does not welcome intruders, it devours them. To the west, the land dies into silence. The Atacama Desert, so dry that not a single weather station registered rain for decades, so ancient that it may be the oldest desert the world has ever known. A place where the wind carries no scent because nothing grows to give it fragrance, where a human being can walk for days without leaving a single footprint because the ground is too hard to remember. Between these two worlds, the drowning forest and the thirsting desert, the Andes rise like a judgment, a stone tribunal watching over the continent. And in the thin air between them, humans learned what it meant to bend without breaking, or break without being remembered. Civilization here was not inevitable. It was earned. It was clawed from cliffs, wrestled from storms, bargained from soil that resisted every seed. And yet, this is precisely where extraordinary people emerged. When most of the world built on plains, they built on impossible slopes. When most of the world sowed in soft earth, they sowed in the bones of mountains. When most of the world measured success by expansion, they measured success by survival. And from that survival came genius. To live in the Andes is to live inside a vertical world. A world where 1 mile of walking forward might mean climbing the height of a cathedral, where one day could take you from sweltering tropic valleys to tundra cold enough to freeze your breath, where altitude is not just a number, but a law, one that dictates which plants grow, which animals endure, and which humans can work without fainting. The Andean people learned to read these altitudes like a second language. Above 2,000 meters, the Quechua zone, warm valleys, hospitable to maize. Above 3,000 meters, the Sunni zone, where life compresses itself into potatoes, the crop that can thrive in the teeth of frost. Above 4,000 meters, the Puna, grasslands cold as blade edges where herds of alpaca and llama move like small breathing clouds. Higher still, the world ends. Ice, stone, wind, nothing more. And yet they climbed, and yet they built. On slopes, where even standing upright is difficult, they carved terraces, hundreds of them, thousands of them. Each one a declaration that human intention could persuade the mountain to yield. These terraces were not merely agricultural structures. They were treaties, a pact between humans and the land, sealed with stone, soil, sweat, and will. Each terrace wall leaned backward by design, absorbing the heat of the sun by day and releasing it at night, warming the crops like a cradle of stone. Beneath them, layers of gravel and sand formed drainage systems more efficient than many modern farms. They moved topsoil uphill by hand, lifting the fertility of valleys onto the backs of mountains. No beast of burden helped them, not one, for there were no oxen here, no horses, no animals strong enough to plow. Everything was carried by human bodies, or by the llamas, which were pack carriers, not plow animals. Their achievements were not built on metal or machines. They were built on coordination, cooperation, and a worldview in which land was not owned but stewarded. The Andes shaped the people, but the people reshaped the Andes. Look at Moray, the circular terraces descending like the rings of an ancient stone amphitheater. This was not a farm. It was a laboratory. Temperature changed with each step downward, 15 degrees from top to bottom, allowing them to test crops across an entire climate gradient in a single place. A masterpiece of agronomy centuries ahead of its time, thousands of potato varieties, hundreds of types of maize, plants engineered not merely to grow, but to endure. Every field was a lesson in resilience. Every harvest was an act of defiance. But the Andes did not mold their people through agriculture alone. They forged something deeper, something psychological. When you grow up, where the earth trembles without warning, where stones fall from cliffs like sudden verdicts, where the weather can erase a village overnight, you learn to see the world differently. You learn humility, because mountains do not negotiate. You learn patience, because stone does not hurry. You learn cooperation, because no family can terrace a slope alone. The Andean mind was shaped by the tension between fear and awe. Between the fragility of life and the permanence of stone, between the cruelty of nature and its capacity to sustain, if respected. Here, survival was communal. Here, one person's labor mattered only insofar as it contributed to the labor of all. Here, society functioned not on the fragile concept of wealth, but on the robust reality of contribution. If the modern world is individualistic, the Andean world was orchestral. Each person a note in a larger harmony, each village a chord in a symphony conducted by the mountains themselves. This worldview birthed engineering feats that, even today, defy comprehension. Bridges stretched over gorges so deep, the river looked like a thin thread of silver. Roads clung to cliff faces, narrow as a breath. Caravans of llamas walked single file, carrying coca leaves, spices, dried fish. Fabrics dyed in colors only mountain sun could reveal. And every few kilometers, small tambos, shelters built not for comfort, but for continuity, weighted like beads strung along the path of empire. These roads were not merely for armies. They were for communication, messages carried by runners who sprinted through thin air, passing information from hand to hand like sparks traveling along a fuse. In a landscape where nature shredded human plans without apology, they wove a network that held their world together. Because in the Andes, unity is not optional. Unity is survival. And that unity created something more important than engineering. It created identity. The people here did not see themselves as masters of the land. They saw themselves as participants in a cosmic order. Mountains were not obstacles. They were ancestors. Rivers were not resources. They were lifelines. Stone was not dead matter. It was the memory of the earth. Thus, when the Inca rose, they did not simply inherit a landscape. They inherited a relationship. A relationship between humans and nature that was as spiritual as it was practical. A relationship that taught them how to build cities in the clouds. A relationship that taught them how to endure what others could not. A relationship that whispered one truth over and over. Nothing given freely survives. Only what is earned through struggle endures. And in this crucible of granite and storm, one civilization found its destiny, not to rule the mountains, but to become an extension of them. When we look at Machu Picchu today, its terraces wrapped around cliffs like green ribbons, its stones fitted so closely that not even a blade of grass can slip between them. We are not looking at a miracle. We are looking at a logical conclusion. A conclusion born from centuries of people learning the language of altitude. A conclusion sculpted by hands that understood the rhythm of seasons at multiple elevations. A conclusion carved by a culture that believed stone itself could hold memory, could embody order, could withstand the trembling of the earth. The Andes forged them, and in return, they forged the Andes. Not with domination, but with adaptation. Not with conquest, but with comprehension. Not with arrogance, but with awe. In this land where life is a daily negotiation with death, humans became something extraordinary, not because they challenged the mountains, but because they listened to them. And that listening became architecture, it became agriculture, it became empire. Machu Picchu is not a marvel because it is improbable. It is a marvel because in the Andes, anything less would have been impossible. Yet the Andes shaped more than bodies and minds. They shaped time itself. In this vertical world, time did not move in straight lines. It spiraled, circled, breathed. A storm could erase a season's work in one afternoon. A single warm wind could coax a barren slope into sudden fertility. The people learned to abandon the illusion of control and instead mastered the art of anticipation. The mountains taught them that nothing lasts forever, and yet everything returns. Snow melts, then freezes. Crops fail, then flourish. Empires rise, then fall. In the Andes, impermanence was not a threat, it was a teacher. And this understanding seeped into everything they created. Their buildings leaned inward, embracing the tremors of the earth rather than resisting them. Their terraces curved with the mountains rather than cutting across them. Their rituals acknowledged the unpredictable rather than denying it. It is this acceptance of duality, of fragility and endurance, of hardship and abundance that made their civilization both powerful and humble. There is a quiet wisdom in a people who choose to build not for domination, but for coexistence. A wisdom in recognizing that the mountain grants permission, and that permission can be revoked at any time. A wisdom in knowing that strength is not the absence of fear, but the ability to move gracefully within its shadow. And so, when we look at the Inca world taking shape across these peaks, we are not merely seeing an empire. We are seeing a philosophy carved into geology, a worldview that understood the earth not as property, but as partner. Their greatest accomplishment was not the cities they built, nor the roads they stretched across impossible distances. Their greatest accomplishment was learning how to endure without severing their connection to the world that sustained them. It was this endurance, spiritual as much as physical, that would one day allow them to build Machu Picchu, a city that seemed less constructed than summoned from the mountain's own memory. And it is this same endurance that still echoes through the stones today, long after the empire that shaped them has faded into silence. Before the Inca carved their highways across the Andes, before they raised Cusco as the navel of a continent, before the imperial messengers ran like shadows through the mountain corridors, the Andes were already alive, with memory, with ambition, with civilizations that had carved their own questions into stone. History rarely begins where we notice it. Civilizations do not spring from nothing. Empires are not born, they accumulate. And the Inca, for all their brilliance, were not the first to listen to the mountains. Long before their rise, in the deserts, highlands, and coastlines of Andean South America, other cultures had experimented with the raw materials of civilization: stone, water, faith, fear, and time. They built rituals before they built armies. They crafted philosophies before they crafted states. They learned to shape the land, and in doing so, they shaped themselves. To understand the Inca, we must descend into this older world, where innovation was slow, painful, fragile, and magnificent. The first of these ancestors were the Moche, who lived on the northern coast, where rivers cut narrow green ribbons through an otherwise merciless desert. The Moche did not build with stone, they built with vision. They were potters without equal, sculptors whose ceramics spoke more honestly than their rulers ever could. Their vessels carried the faces of gods and warriors, the anguish of captives, the triumph of kings. They left behind portraits so vivid, so intimate, that 3,000 years later, we still recognize the curve of a cheek, the sorrow of an eye. They spoke through clay, and their clay remembered. But the Moche were not merely artists, they were engineers of water. They carved irrigation canals across the desert, teaching the earth to bloom in places where nature had decreed there should be nothing but dust. They built pyramids of adobe brick, millions of bricks, each marked by the hands that molded it. Those bricks still bear fingerprints today, the fossilized echoes of workers who lived and died long before the idea of an Inca Empire was even conceived. Yet the Moche vanished. Not all at once, not violently, but slowly, quietly, erased by shifting rivers, by climatic chaos, by the unpredictable temper of the desert they had so carefully domesticated. They left behind empty temples and broken irrigation canals, like throat lines in an ancient body that no longer breathed. Far to the south, in a region the sun scorched mercilessly by day and chilled without mercy by night, another civilization left its mark, not upon clay, but upon the landscape itself. These were the Nazca. They did not carve aqueducts alone or build towering cities. Instead, they etched the desert with lines so vast, so geometrically precise, so impossibly straight, that they could only be fully seen from the sky. A sky no human had ever flown. The Nazca drew hummingbirds, whose wings stretched longer than a football field. They traced monkeys with tails curling like question marks across the desert floor. They summoned condors, spirals, arrows, trapezoids, lines that cut the earth like incisions on a living body. Some scholars call these lines offerings. Others call them calendars. Others call them prayers carved into the skin of the world. But perhaps they were all of these things. Or perhaps they were something else entirely. Markers for gods, markers for the dead, markers for the sun as it traveled its eternal path above a people who knew they were small and dared to create something monumental anyway. What we do know is this: the Nazca understood scale in a way few early civilizations did. They understood the magnificent contradiction of humanity, the desire to leave a mark that outlives the body, even in a land that refuses permanence. If the Moche mastered clay, the Nazca mastered perspective. But civilization in the Andes did not root itself only in deserts. Far away, high in the cold brilliance of the Altiplano, near the blue expanse of Lake Titicaca, where water meets sky without interruption, stood one of the most enigmatic cultures of all, Tiwanaku. To walk among the ruins of Tiwanaku is to feel the presence of a people who believed stone was not merely material, but metaphysical. Their temples were not made of many stones, but of few. Massive monoliths carved and fitted with an elegance that defies modern machinery. The gateway of the sun stands there still, its carvings sharp despite 1,000 winters, its symbolism enigmatic, its purpose debated. But many agree on one thing. Tiwanaku was a civilization of philosophers, not philosophers of words, but of stone. They believed the world could be read in angles and shadows, in the way a stone aligns with the solstice, in the way the lake reflects the heavens. Their masonry was measured not by function alone, but by meaning. This was a civilization that looked at rock, not as resistance, but as revelation. They carved canals to moderate temperature, using water not only to irrigate, but to stabilize microclimates. They built raised fields that warmed roots by trapping solar heat. They tamed the thin air cold, the razor winds, the altitude that punishes the unprepared. But Tiwanaku, too, fell, perhaps due to drought or internal strain, or the quiet exhaustion that swallows civilizations from within. What remains today is a geometry of ghosts, stones waiting for voices that will never return. And then came the Wari. If the Moche were artisans, if the Nazca were visionaries, if Tiwanaku were philosophers, the Wari were architects of human order. They were the first in the Andes to create something that resembled a centralized state. They built roads that stretched like veins across the highlands, precursors to the Inca road system. They built terraced farms on a scale that soared across mountain faces like agricultural cathedrals. They designed cities planned with a precision almost militaristic in its symmetry. Where earlier civilizations had relied on ritual or artistry or cosmic alignment, the Wari relied on structure, on corridors, plazas, storage facilities, and systems of governance that knit far-flung regions together under a shared administration. If Tiwanaku understood stone, the Wari understood logistics. They were the first to dream of an Andes connected not merely by culture, but by road, by law, by a common vision of order. And though their empire eventually crumbled, its bones remained. The terraces, the canals, the administrative techniques, the roadways that would one day become the arteries of a greater empire. And so, layer by layer, millennium by millennium, the Andes filled with knowledge. Not a knowledge written in books, but in landscapes. A knowledge not recorded in ink, but in terraces, canals, temples, pottery, desert lines, monoliths, raised fields, and the Inca inherited all of it. The rise of the Inca was not a spontaneous miracle. It was a convergence. For 1,000 years, each civilization answered a different question the Andes imposed. The Moche asked, "How do we shape identity?" Their answer, "Through art that refuses to forget." The Nazca asked, "How do we speak to the gods?" Their answer, "Through lines that defy the limits of human scale." Tiwanaku asked, "How do we build permanence?" Their answer, "Through stone that aligns with eternity." The Wari asked, "How do we organize humanity?" Their answer, "Through structure that outlasts ambition." And the Inca took these answers and wove them together. They were not imitators, they were synthesizers. They did not copy, they refined. They did not merely build, they inherited, improved, elevated. Where the Wari laid roads, the Inca expanded them into a network so vast it rivaled the Roman Empire. Where Tiwanaku carved stone with mystic precision, the Inca perfected masonry so flawless it seemed grown rather than built. Where the Moche shaped art, the Inca shaped identity, binding dozens of cultures into a single imperial tapestry. Where the Nazca conversed with the sky, the Inca aligned their temples with the stars, their city grids with the solstice, their empire with the cosmic order they believed governed all existence. The Inca were the last link in a chain thousands of years long, a chain forged by hands that never met, minds that never knew each other, yet civilizations that unconsciously collaborated across time. It is tempting to call them the pinnacle, but a pinnacle cannot exist without the mountain beneath it. The Inca stood tall because countless civilizations laid the foundations of altitude itself. To understand them is to understand this lineage, a lineage of endurance, experimentation, collapse, reinvention, and above all, memory. The Andes remember every civilization that tried to silence its storms, and every civilization that learned instead to harmonize with them. And the Inca, more than any who came before, learned the final truth. Empires do not arise from strength alone. They arise from inheritance, from the quiet accumulation of wisdom, from the bones of the forgotten, from the ideas of the fallen, from the dreams of those who never lived to see what their dreams would become. And this is how an empire was born, rooted not in a single moment, but in 1,000 years of human persistence. And yet, what makes these forgotten civilizations extraordinary is not merely what they built, but what they attempted. Their greatness does not lie only in their triumphs, but in their failures. Failures that carried lessons forward like seeds traveling on the wind of centuries. For every successful terrace that clung to the mountain, there were terraces that collapsed. For every canal that brought life, there were canals that died beneath shifting rivers. For every temple that survived the ages, there were temples consumed by earth or sand or silence. But failure in the Andes was never the end. It was instruction. It was iteration. It was the quiet tutor of a continent learning, slowly, painfully, insistently, how to carve order from the most disobedient landscapes on Earth. When the Inca finally stepped into history's gaze, they did so carrying the weight of countless unnamed engineers, potters, farmers, astronomers, priests, and builders whose ideas had accumulated like sediment. Each civilization had pressed its imprint into the mountains, and the mountains had preserved those imprints long after the cultures themselves had vanished. It is this continuity, a continuity without writing, without libraries, without monuments to authors, that makes the Andean world unique. Knowledge survived, not because it was recorded, but because it was practiced, not because it was archived, but because it was embodied. Stone remembered what people forgot. Waterways remembered what rulers erased. Fields remembered which crops endured frost and which surrendered to it. And so, by the time the Inca emerged from the highlands around Cusco, the Andes themselves had already been prepared. The land had been studied, disciplined, sculpted, and spiritually interpreted for more than a millennium. The Inca did not inherit ruins. They inherited blueprints. They inherited experiments. They inherited dreams that had not yet found their final form. What they created would astonish the world. But what made their creation possible was the vast, invisible foundation beneath them. A foundation built by civilizations whose names the wind still carries across the mountains, long after their voices have faded. No one knows precisely where the Inca came from. Their arrival in the highlands of Cusco is wrapped in a fog of stories. Stories that resist the cold dissection of historians. Stories that refuse to die even after centuries of retelling. Stories that linger not because they are factual, but because they are true in a deeper sense. For the Inca, origin was not a question of geography, but of destiny. Some said they emerged from a cave called Pacaritambo, 3 brothers and 4 sisters, born from the earth itself, stepping from darkness into light, with a mission stitched into their bones. Others believed they were sent by Inti, the sun god, descending from an island on Lake Titicaca, carrying a golden staff that would pierce the ground where their new capital must be built. Still others whispered that their ancestors wandered through endless valleys until the mountains themselves spoke, guiding them toward a place where stone and spirit intertwined. These stories contradict one another, but they reveal something profound. The Inca did not see themselves as wanderers seeking a home. They saw themselves as chosen to bring order to a land fractured by time and war, chosen to bind the highlands into coherence, chosen to tame the mountains not through conquest alone, but through harmony. Myth, for the Inca, was not an escape from reality. Myth was the blueprint of reality. And so, when their first rulers walked through the marshlands of the valley that would one day become Cusco, they did not see mud, insects, or poverty. They saw the axis of the world waiting to be revealed. They saw the point where the threads of heaven and earth crossed. They saw a city not yet born, but already alive in imagination. Cusco, when they found it, was little more than a scattering of huts. The ground was uneven, slick with wetlands, surrounded by hills that belonged to other tribes. No empire in its right mind would choose such a place as its capital. But the Inca were not yet an empire, and their mind was not shaped by the logic of strategy. It was shaped by the logic of belief. Belief that space could be transformed. Belief that destiny could be constructed. Belief that mountains accepted the worthy and rejected the weak. And so, with hands that shook from cold and hunger, they began. Not with monuments, not with armies, but with the simplest act of empire, survival. They drained marshes. They leveled ground. They cut stones from nearby hills and dragged them down slopes too steep for animals to traverse. They shaped those stones into homes, crude at first, but sturdy. Then they shaped those homes into districts, those districts into neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods into a city. But a city is not built only from walls. It is built from identity. And identity is forged in the furnace of hardship. In those early years, the Inca were not rulers. They were one tribe among many, one voice in a chorus of conflict. The highlands were a tapestry of rival ambitions, each valley guarded by warriors who believed only in their own supremacy. Only the mountain peaks remained neutral. Everything else was contested. The Inca survived not because they were stronger, but because they were relentless. The mountains had taught them patience. The marshes had taught them resilience. The cold had taught them humility. And so they grew, not rapidly, but steadily, like a tree carving its roots deeper into the earth before ever reaching upward. While other tribes fought for immediate victory, the Inca prepared for eventual inevitability. They observed, they learned, they borrowed, they absorbed. They watched how other cultures irrigated their fields, and they refined those techniques. They watched how rivals organized communities, and they improved on those structures. They listened to the legends of older civilizations, and they stitched those legends into their own worldview. Every idea they found, whether from ally or enemy, they transformed into something sharper, cleaner, more coherent. This was their gift. They did not invent the Andes. They interpreted them. And slowly, the mountains began to respond. Cusco rose, shaped like a puma, the sacred animal of the earth. Rivers were redirected. Canals were carved. Temples were built where once there were only reeds. What had been a swamp became the spiritual axis of an emerging order. The Inca believed they were chosen, and through sheer effort, discipline, and vision, they reshaped their environment until it reflected that belief back to them. But even in these early days, when the Inca were still few in number and modest in influence, something unmistakable stirred within them. Something that had been dormant during the eras of Moche, Nazca, Tiwanaku, and Wari. Something that none of those civilizations had fully unlocked. It was a sense of purpose that transcended tribe. A sense that unity was not merely a strategy, but a destiny. When neighboring peoples looked at the land, they saw threat. When the Inca looked at the land, they saw architecture. When others saw mountains, the Inca saw stairways to the divine. When others saw rivers, the Inca saw veins carrying life across a body of stone. When others saw borders, the Inca saw fractures yearning to be healed. And so they acted, not with haste, but with intention. Every wall they raised, they aligned with the movement of the sun. Every district they planned, they synchronized with the constellations. Every ritual they practiced reaffirmed the cosmic order they believed they had been entrusted to maintain. They were not yet conquerors. They were not yet builders of roadways thousands of kilometers long. They were not yet sculptors of stone so precise it seemed poured rather than carved. But the blueprint of the empire existed already, in myth, in memory, in the marrow of their understanding of the world. Like the earliest light before sunrise, the Inca vision glowed long before it illuminated the Andes. And from this vision came declaration. Not spoken aloud, but embedded in the city they were creating. Cusco would not be merely a capital. It would be a statement. That order could emerge from chaos. That harmony could emerge from hardship. That destiny could emerge from dirt. What is extraordinary is not that the Inca believed they were chosen. Many peoples across history have believed the same. What is extraordinary is that the Inca behaved as though being chosen required proof. Proof offered through labor, discipline, sacrifice, and mastery. They believed they had been granted a mission. But they believed even more deeply that missions must be earned. And so, day after day, generation after generation, they strengthened the roots of their fledgling city. They trained warriors, not to conquer, but to defend. They built storehouses, not to gather wealth, but to endure famine. They honored the sun, not because it favored them, but because they understood that divinity requires reciprocity. The Andes had birthed countless civilizations, but none had listened to the mountains the way the Inca did. None had interpreted nature's silence with such precision. None had synthesized myth and strategy with such clarity. Myth guided their steps. Reality sharpened them. And the union of both made them unstoppable. By the time Cusco began to flourish, the Inca were no longer merely inhabitants of the Andes. They had become interpreters of its laws, guardians of its rhythms, architects of its destiny. Their mythic origins were not stories to entertain children, but stories that shaped policy, diplomacy, construction, warfare, identity. For a people born from legend, the transition into history was not a step, it was an unfolding. From cave, from lake, from golden staff, from wandering, whatever their beginning had been, what mattered was where they were going. And they were going toward empire. Yet the shadow of empire did not fall suddenly. It crept, quiet as dawn, across the highlands. The Inca grew not because they conquered swiftly, but because they believed deeply. They believed in order. They believed in purpose. They believed that the scattered tribes of the Andes were not meant to remain scattered. And they believed that if no one else could bring unity, they must. The seeds of expansion were planted long before the first military campaign. They sprouted in the minds of rulers who saw what others did not. That destiny was not bestowed, it was built. Cusco, once a swamp, was now a heart. And hearts do not remain still. They send blood outward. What would follow in the coming generations? The warlords, the reforms, the architectures of power, the rise of kings with names that would echo across centuries, was only possible because of these beginnings. Because a people who believed themselves chosen acted as though they were responsible. Because a tribe who stepped from myth into mud refused to remain small. Because a civilization born from sacred stories shaped itself into a sacred force. The Inca would soon rise to seize the destiny they believed awaited them. But before their empire stretched across deserts, forests, and mountains, before their armies marched in disciplined silence, before they welded an entire continent into a single administrative organism, before they faced the cataclysm that would one day tear it all apart, before any of that, they were a people looking at a swamp and seeing a world. And that, more than any myth, is the true beginning of their story. And yet, in those early centuries when the Inca were still shaping themselves, the greatest transformation was not visible in their architecture or their rituals. It was visible in their imagination. They began to see time not as a straight line, but as a weaving in which past and future were threads pulled taut by the choices of the present. In this worldview, destiny was not a prophecy, but a craft. Each action tightened or loosened the tapestry. Each victory or loss shifted the pattern. Each generation inherited not the fate of their ancestors, but the responsibility to refine it. This way of thinking gave the Inca an unusual kind of confidence, quiet, deliberate, patient. The kind of confidence that does not rush toward expansion, but prepares for it with almost monastic discipline. They understood that an empire cannot be summoned overnight. It must first be imagined, then structured, then tested, then strengthened through countless small decisions made in the shadows of mountains that do not forgive weakness. A lesser people might have built walls around their small settlement and remained there, but the Inca looked at walls and saw the beginnings of roads. They looked at villages and saw the outline of provinces. They looked at themselves and saw what they had not yet become, but would. In this sense, the Inca were modern long before modernity. They planned centuries ahead. They imagined a people unified not only by force, but by purpose. They believed the cosmos itself had symmetry, and that their society must echo that symmetry in every terrace, every ritual, every law. This belief infused even their smallest actions with weight. To move a stone was not labor. It was alignment. To plant a field was not agriculture. It was participation in the order of the universe. And so, when history finally turned its gaze toward the Andes and found the Inca rising from a swamp-turned sanctuary, it was not witnessing the birth of a kingdom. It was witnessing the emergence of an idea that had waited generations to be strong enough to reveal itself. The world would soon feel the force of that idea as it unfolded into empire. But for now, the mountains simply watched as a people prepared to step fully from myth into power. All empires possess a turning point, an hour when destiny condenses into the will of a single human being, a figure who steps into history not as a participant, but as a catalyst. For Rome, it was Augustus. For Macedonia, Alexander. For the Inca, it was Pachacuti. His name meant the one who overturns time and space. And for the Andes, that is exactly what he became. A hinge upon which the universe turned. A force that reshaped not only the geography of a kingdom, but the imagination of a people. Before Pachacuti, the Inca were a rising tribe among many. After Pachacuti, they were the axis of a continent. History remembers him as a conqueror, a statesman, an organizer of worlds. But the Andes remember him as something deeper, as the first human who dared to translate the silent logic of the mountains into the architecture of empire. There had been rulers before him, but none who could perceive the world the way he did, with a clarity that bordered on prophecy. When Pachacuti inherited Cusco, it was still rough stone, mud paths, and crowded houses. A city with potential, yes, but potential that slept beneath disorder. Pachacuti saw not what it was, but what it could be. He saw the future reflected in the unfinished walls, the unfinished ceremonies, the unfinished dreams of his ancestors. And, with a mind sharpened by vision and need, he began to carve reality into alignment with imagination. Under his command, Cusco was reborn. Streets were reshaped along cosmic lines. Foundations were ripped out and rebuilt with stones so finely cut that they seemed to breathe with the earth itself. Temples rose where mere huts once stood. Their walls fitted so perfectly that even centuries of earthquakes could not pry them apart. This was not construction, it was consecration. Cusco was no longer merely a city. It became a living prayer, a center where heaven and earth conversed through stone. But Pachacuti was not content with sanctifying the heart of his world. He intended to expand its reach. And so began one of the most remarkable transformations in human history. A transformation that unfolded not in decades, but in the span of a single lifetime. War under Pachacuti was not chaos. It was choreography. He studied his enemies before he fought them. He learned their fears before he threatened them. He understood their loyalties before he fragmented them. And when he struck, it was precise, swift, decisive, like a blade guided not by muscle, but by intention. Yet Pachacuti knew what every great leader knows: the sword alone cannot sustain a world. Conquest wins territory, diplomacy wins allegiance. And so, he forged a second path, soft where the first was sharp, persuasive where the first was forceful. He offered gifts instead of threats. He sent messages instead of declarations. He extended invitations instead of ultimatums. His envoys carried textiles finer than anything the highlands had woven before. His ambassadors offered alliances sealed with marriages, with feasts, with shared rituals. And in the end, many tribes joined the Inca, not because they were defeated, but because they were seduced. Seduced by the promise of order, abundance, and purpose. They made a desert, Tacitus once wrote of Rome, and called it peace. But the Inca made a network of roads, rituals, and reciprocity, and called it unity. At the center of this unity was a road system so vast it defies belief. Over 40,000 kilometers of stone, dirt, rope, and engineering genius stretched across deserts, jungles, and mountains. Roads threaded through cliff sides like veins. Suspension bridges swayed across canyons so deep, the rivers below looked like threads of silver. And along those roads moved armies, goods, messengers, and ideas, stitching together a world that had never before imagined itself connected. Under Pachacuti, the Andes ceased to be separate. They became a single organism, Tahuantinsuyu, the land of the four quarters, where every direction pointed toward Cusco. But perhaps his greatest innovation was not his military brilliance nor his architectural ambition. It was his reimagining of what an economy could be. While the great civilizations of the old world built societies upon gold, silver, coins, and markets, Pachacuti created something different, something radical. In his world, there was no currency. In his world, no individual owned land. In his world, wealth flowed not through private hands, but through the state, the temples, and the collective. Taxes were not paid in metal or grain, but in labor. Mit'a, obligatory service, became the heartbeat of the empire. Every citizen contributed a portion of their year to build roads, terrace mountains, fight wars, or grow crops. And the state, in return, guaranteed that no one starved, even in times of drought or hardship. Across the empire, colossal storehouses, kulkas, rose like guardians of survival. They were filled with maize, potatoes, dried meats, textiles, tools, and medicines. These reserves could feed millions for years. They were an empire's lungs, breathing in surplus and breathing out sustenance. From blood came order. From order came eternity. And yet, Pachacuti was not only a builder of systems. He was a builder of meaning. A warrior king, yes, but also a poet. A ruler who carved victories into stone and verses into the air. Songs attributed to him survive. Fragments of longing, devotion, fear, and cosmic reflection. He wrote not merely to praise gods, but to understand them. Not merely to record triumphs, but to interpret existence. In these verses, he calls upon Viracocha, the creator god, who brought the world out of chaos by shaping humanity from stone. This was not metaphor to the Inca. It was identity. They believed they were literally carved from the earth, made of the same substance as the mountains they lived upon. And Pachacuti embodied this belief more fully than any ruler before him. He acted as though shaping stone, shaping cities, Shaping society was synonymous with shaping the destiny the gods had assigned. Which brings us to Machu Picchu. High above the Urubamba River, nestled among peaks that pierced the clouds, Pachacuti ordered the construction of a city unlike any other. A sanctuary, a retreat, a watchtower of the sky, or perhaps a shrine hidden from the world below, a place where only the initiated could speak with the sun. Scholars argue endlessly about its purpose. Was it a royal estate, a ceremonial center, an astronomical observatory, a fortress, a temple, a monument to eternity? No answer satisfies, because Machu Picchu refuses simplicity. It stands in silence, its terraces stepping upward like thoughts climbing toward revelation, its temples aligned with solstices and stars, its stones whispering not their function, but their presence. A presence that refuses to erode. Whatever Machu Picchu was, it was an extension of Pachacuti's mind. A place where architecture became philosophy, where stone became scripture, where the world bent to the shape of one ruler's imagination. The golden age of Tahuantinsuyu was not golden because it glittered. It was golden because it endured. Endured in stone, endured in roadways, endured in the memory of mountains. And at the center of that endurance stood one man, a builder of cities, a reshaper of landscapes, a weaver of political webs, a poet of empire, a visionary who saw a world fragmented and imagined it whole. Empires rise, empires fall, but few empires are ever truly understood. The Inca Empire, Pachacuti's masterpiece, was not merely a political structure but a philosophical one. A worldview translated into roads, rituals, and administrative grids. A civilization that believed order was sacred and that chaos could be sculpted into harmony. And so, under Pachacuti, the world did not simply expand. It clarified. It cohered. It took shape. Tahuantinsuyu became not a kingdom, not a territory, but a direction. 4 directions, converging at Cusco, the navel of the earth. The empire of the 4 quarters. The empire that walked the line between myth and engineering. The empire that listened to the mountains and answered with cities that defied them. This was the zenith, the moment when the Inca believed their destiny was secured forever. But destiny, like stone, can crack. And what Pachacuti built with brilliance would later be tested with violence, tested by storms no emperor could foresee. Yet even at the height of Pachacuti's brilliance, even as the empire radiated outward from Cusco like spokes of a divine wheel, the seeds of uncertainty lay hidden beneath the polished surface of triumph. For all his achievements, Pachacuti understood something most conquerors never realize: that empire is not the same thing as permanence. Victory is temporary. Stone is temporary. Even the mountains, though seemingly eternal, are temporary in the eyes of time. And so, he ruled not with the arrogance of a man who believed he had conquered destiny, but with the vigilance of one who believed destiny required constant tending. He established laws not to enshrine his power, but to discipline the world against fragmentation. He restructured kinship lines so the empire would not dissolve when a ruler died. He standardized rituals, festivals, and the worship of the sun, not as a tool of oppression, but as a language that bound peoples from distant valleys into a shared rhythm. When he looked upon Cusco, he did not see a capital. He saw a compass, orienting millions toward a single vision of cosmic order. But Pachacuti also knew the fragility of human beings. He had seen tribes rise, thrive, and vanish. He had walked through the ruins of those who came before. Wari cities turned to dust, Tiwanaku's temples silent, Nazca lines fading beneath the desert wind. He understood that power unmoored from purpose collapses. He understood that unity maintained only by force decays the moment the sword is lowered. Thus he sought to build something greater than empire. He sought to build coherence. Coherence between land and law. Coherence between myth and administration. Coherence between conquest and compassion. For Pachacuti did not merely expand territory, he expanded meaning. Under his reign, the Inca worldview crystallized into a single truth: that humanity could live in alignment with the cosmos, that society could reflect the geometry of the stars, that order was not an imposition, but a revelation. And perhaps it was this belief, this serene, disciplined faith in the harmony between humanity and creation, that propelled him to construct Machu Picchu, not in the valleys where life is easy, but in a place where life teeters on the edge of sky. For what better demonstration of Inca conviction than to build a sanctuary in a location where the mountain itself seems to rise to meet the clouds? Some say Pachacuti retreated there in old age, seeking communion with the sun in the silence between peaks. Some say it was his private laboratory of thought, where he contemplated the structure of the world he was building. Some believe the city was a mirror, a stone reflection of a cosmic diagram mapping the heavens onto the earth. But perhaps the truth is simpler and deeper. Machu Picchu was the Inca soul made visible. A union of engineering and reverence, a marriage of precision and poetry, a declaration that human intention, when disciplined by purpose, can shape even the most impossible landscapes. And yet, for all its majesty, Machu Picchu also reveals a hint of vulnerability. A city hidden is a city protected, and a city protected is a city aware of the shadows that stalk power. Pachacuti may have commanded armies and sculpted nations, but he knew that no ruler, no matter how brilliant, can foresee every threat. The world is vast, the future larger still, and empires, no matter how disciplined, are always built on the shifting tension between what is controlled and what is unknowable. As Pachacuti grew older, he stood atop terraces that touched the heavens and looked out across an empire that stretched farther than any Andean mind before him could have imagined. He saw roads cutting through jungles and deserts. He saw warehouses filled with grain, armies that moved like a single organism, cities rising where once there were only small villages. He saw a world reshaped according to a pattern he believed reflected the will of the gods. Yet even then, even at the summit of achievement, he must have sensed the truth all great leaders eventually confront, that an empire is not cemented by triumph, but tested by catastrophe, and catastrophe always comes. It is not the enemy of empire, but its measure. Pachacuti would not live to witness the storms gathering on the horizon. But the empire he had forged, the empire of 4 directions, the empire that bent the Andes into harmony, would soon face challenges no amount of poetry or engineering could prevent. For now, however, in this moment of golden light, Pachacuti's world stood whole. A masterpiece, a monument, a miracle carved from stone and will. And like all miracles, it was beautiful because it was temporary. The Inca Empire, Tahuantinsuyu, had been sculpted with discipline, vision, and an almost sacred sense of order. Its roads obeyed the mountains, its cities conversed with the sun, its people moved in harmony with the rhythm of empire. For nearly a century, it had expanded with the quiet confidence of a force destined to endure. But destiny does not favor permanence. Sometimes the end of a civilization begins not with the roar of armies, but with a whisper, soft, unnoticed, lethal. The first cracks in Tahuantinsuyu were not carved by swords, but carried on breath, disease, a concept the Inca had never named, never understood, never prepared for. A specter carried by traders, by captives, by winds that traveled faster than any messenger running the imperial roads. A force that slipped into valleys, villages, and fortresses without the courtesy of warning. It arrived from the north, unseen, unheard. By the time the Inca realized something unnatural had entered their world, the devastation was already in motion. Entire hamlets fell silent. Fields remained unharvested. Children died in their mother's arms. Elders vanished before their stories could be passed on. Death did not discriminate by rank, wealth, or lineage. It moved faster than fear, faster than reason, like a fire spreading underground. In some regions, 9 of every 10 people were gone. In others, whole bloodlines ended in a single night. The empire's administrators kept records, but even the quipu, those cords of knots that captured the pulse of the empire, could not capture the scale of collapse. Plague unstitched the empire one village at a time, and finally, it reached the emperor. Huayna Capac was a man molded in the image of Pachacuti, strong, decisive, capable of crushing rebellions and expanding borders. Under his leadership, the Inca Empire reached its greatest territorial extent. But he was no match for an enemy that could not be seen, heard, challenged, or negotiated with. When he fell ill in the northern territories, the empire held its breath. When he died, the empire exhaled into chaos. But fate dealt an even crueler blow. The son he had chosen as heir also succumbed to the plague. A ruler gone, a successor gone, a lineage broken. The Inca had built a world where everything had a place, everything had a purpose, everything moved in accordance with a cosmic symmetry. But symmetry shatters easily, and when it shatters, it cuts. Tahuantinsuyu, suddenly leaderless, was thrust into a vacuum of authority. A vacuum empires rarely survive. The throne of the Sapa Inca, once the seat of divine order, became an object of contention. 2 sons remained, Huascar, who ruled from Cusco, and Atahualpa, who governed from Quito. Both believed themselves chosen. Both believed themselves rightful. Both believed destiny bent toward their ascent. But destiny bends only to those who can hold it. And neither brother understood that in fighting for the empire, they would destroy the very thing they sought to own. War came swiftly. It began with accusations whispered in courtrooms and plazas. It escalated into skirmishes along trade routes. Then armies assembled. Armies that once marched together under a single banner, now marching against each other with the fury of betrayal. The Civil War was not noble. It was not glorious. It was fratricide on a continental scale. Cities that once flourished under imperial order burned. Temples were desecrated. Grain reserves were emptied. Villages pledged allegiance only to be punished when the other brothers' forces arrived. Brothers-in-law became enemies. Generals who once served side by side now slaughtered each other in ravines. The blood that had once expanded the empire now irrigated its collapse. And through it all, disease still smoldered beneath the surface, its embers igniting wherever soldiers marched, wherever refugees fled, wherever the empire already weakened. It was as though the Andes themselves, once harmonious under Pachacuti's vision, had begun to reject the world he built. The mountains trembled under the weight of chaos, as if warning that cosmic order had been broken. Huascar, ruling from Cusco, claimed legitimacy by inheritance. Atahualpa, ruling from Quito, claimed legitimacy by capability. Huascar saw Atahualpa as a threat to tradition. Atahualpa saw Huascar as a threat to stability. And so the war escalated. Armies of tens of thousands moved across the empire like opposing storms. Cities shifted allegiance repeatedly, torn by terror and uncertainty. Roads built for unity became corridors of carnage. Storehouses built for abundance were plundered to feed armies rather than civilians. After years of struggle, Atahualpa emerged victorious. His generals captured Huáscar, killed his supporters, and marched south toward Cusco to claim the throne that had eluded him. But the victory was ash. Atahualpa inherited not an empire, but a ghost of one. A body drained of blood, a network of roads choked by conflict, a population crippled by plague, a spiritual system fractured by civil war. Tahuantinsuyu, once the empire of 4 directions, now had no direction at all. What remained of unity was illusion. What remained of order was memory. What remained of destiny was dust. And it was in this moment, this fragile, broken, exhausted moment, that the hinge of history turned. Had the Inca been whole, the events that followed might have been different. Had the emperor lived, had the heir survived, had the brothers chosen negotiation over destruction, had the plague never arrived, the empire might have stood firm against the storms approaching from across the sea. But fate had woven another pattern. The Inca had faced their greatest enemy, and their greatest enemy had not carried weapons. It had carried breath. That breath killed an emperor. That breath shattered succession. That breath ignited civil war. That breath hollowed a world that once believed itself ordained by the gods. The empire was not defeated. It dismantled itself. By the time Atahualpa stood victorious, Tahuantinsuyu was a masterpiece cracked down its center. The roads were still there, the temples still there, the stones still shone beneath the sun, but the soul of the empire had splintered. And when an empire loses its soul, even the strongest walls cannot save it. Far away beyond the horizon, ships were approaching, wooden giants carrying men who believed they, too, were chosen, men who carried steel, horses, gunpowder. But above all, they carried certainty. Certainty that the world existed to be claimed, converted, conquered. And they sailed toward a continent weakened by forces it could not see, could not understand, could not escape. The Inca had survived the mountains. They had survived drought, famine, rebellion. They had survived centuries of hardship that would have broken lesser peoples. But they could not survive the invisible. And they could not survive themselves. And so, as Atahualpa's triumph settled like dust over a ruined landscape, the stage was set. An empire stood at the edge of a precipice, unaware that the next step would plunge it into darkness. History was ready to turn. And yet, what makes this moment in history unbearably tragic is not simply that the empire was weakened. It is how it was weakened. Not by invasion, not by treachery, not by famine or natural disaster, but by a collapse from within that unfolded silently, invisibly, inexorably. For centuries, the Inca had believed that harmony came from structure, that order could be engineered, that chaos could be disciplined through ritual, labor, and precision. They believed that the universe leaned toward balance if human beings upheld their duties. But the plague that swept through their world cared nothing for duty. It was indifferent to cosmic order. It ignored the geometry of their cities, the logic of their laws, the sanctity of their temples. It arrived without warning, killed without distinction, and left without explanation. To the Inca, this was not merely a biological disaster. It was a spiritual crisis. For a civilization built upon signs, omens, and celestial alignments, the plague was a message they could not interpret. Priests consulted oracles. Nobles sought answers from the sun. Farmers prayed at mountain shrines. But the gods gave no clarity. The disease came and went with the cold indifference of the wind, and uncertainty is more corrosive than death. When Huayna Capac died, there was a moment, small, fragile, when the empire might have recovered. A council could have chosen a single successor. Provinces could have remained loyal. Generals could have cooperated to preserve the integrity of the realm. But fear had already eaten into the foundations of society. For in the wake of catastrophe, people cling not to unity, but to familiarity. Not to empire, but to lineage. Not to ideal, but to blood. And thus began the slow unwinding of Tahuantinsuyu's internal fabric. Regional lords, once loyal administrators of the Inca system, began acting independently. Local leaders hesitated before committing their troops. Messages traveled the roads more slowly. Bureaucrats, fearing accusations from rival factions, manipulated records. Even the quipu, normally the empire's most reliable instrument of truth, became entangled with political agendas. The civil war between Huáscar and Atahualpa did not occur in a vacuum. It was the visible expression of an invisible disintegration. While armies clashed, the empire's infrastructure weakened. Roads remained functional, but poorly maintained. Storehouses remained full, but poorly guarded. Temples remained open, but priests died faster than they could be replaced. In a world where every system depended on human labor, the disappearance of millions created cracks no ruler could fill. And so, the Civil War was not simply a clash of two princes, it was the culmination of 1,000 smaller collapses, 1,000 frayed edges unraveling at once. In the heat of conflict, neither Huáscar nor Atahualpa paused to consider the true cost of their ambitions. They fought for legitimacy, for divine sanction, for the right to shape the empire in their image. But they failed to see that the empire no longer possessed the strength to bear such violence. War is always destructive. Civil war is self-destruction. But civil war in the aftermath of plague is suicide. And by the time Atahualpa emerged victorious, no triumphal procession could conceal the truth. The empire he claimed had already dissolved. He held the crown, but it was a crown without a kingdom. He commanded armies, but they were armies exhausted by years of loss. He inherited a bureaucracy, but half its officials were dead or displaced. He controlled the land, but the land had lost the people who once gave it purpose. The empire had not been conquered. It had been hollowed. And in many ways, Atahualpa understood this. He understood the magnitude of ruin. He understood that he had won a war, but lost a world. He understood that repair would require decades, perhaps generations. But he also believed he had time. Time to rebuild. Time to unite the regions still loyal to him. Time to restore the cosmic order disrupted by sickness and war. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that time had already run out. Beyond the western horizon, across the unending ocean that the Inca believed marked the boundary between the human world and the realm of spirits, something approached, something unprecedented, something unimaginable. Something that would rewrite the fate of the Andes forever. A handful of ships, a handful of men. A handful of ambitions sharpened by hunger and sanctified by greed. Had they arrived a century earlier, they would have found an empire ready to resist. Had they arrived a decade later, perhaps the empire would have recovered. But they arrived now. In the single moment when the Andes were most vulnerable, when the gods were silent, when the warriors were weary, when the population was thinned, when the empire had torn itself apart. History is not always shaped by strength. Often, it is shaped by timing. And the timing of the Spanish arrival, precise, merciless, fateful, was a blow more devastating than any sword. Even as Atahualpa celebrated his victory in the north, celebrated the end of his brother's challenge, celebrated the consolidation of power, messengers came running along the imperial roads, not always with words. Sometimes only with fear. They spoke of strangers with beards, strangers with metal skin, strangers who rode animals taller than the tallest alpaca, strangers who carried weapons that thundered, strangers who did not belong to this world. And so, as dusk settled over the battered empire, as smoke from burned cities drifted through valleys that once pulsed with life, as Atahualpa prepared to begin the long work of rebuilding, the shadows lengthened. Not from mountains, not from clouds, but from destiny itself. The Inca had survived everything the Andes demanded of them. They had not yet faced what was coming. And in the fragile quiet after the Civil War, the world held its breath, waiting for the next blow, the final blow, the blow that would change everything. When Atahualpa celebrated his victory in the northern city of Cajamarca, the air was thick with triumph. Fires lit the night like constellations pulled down from the heavens. The drums echoed across the highlands, announcing the end of a bitter war that had consumed a generation. To the Inca victor, the world seemed finally ready to return to order, to stitch itself back together after years of fratricide, plague, and chaos. But history does not pause for celebration, and destiny does not wait for the wounded to heal. Far beyond the horizon, past the glittering edge of the Pacific, past everything the Inca believed marked the boundary of the human world, shadows were moving. Not the shadows of mountains or storms, but the shadows of ships. Wooden leviathans pushed across the water by winds the Andean people had never felt. Carrying men the Andes had never seen. These men came not as wanderers, nor as scholars, nor as emissaries. They came as harvesters of fortune. Pizarro and his small band of conquistadors, ragged, weary, driven by hunger, greed, and a theology sharpened like a blade, stepped onto the continent not as guests, but as claimants. They believed the land was theirs before they even saw it. They believed its people were subjects before they even met them. They believed its gold was ordained for them, written into the design of the world by a God whose words they carried like justification. To the Inca, they were an impossibility. To the Spanish, the Inca were a prize. The encounter between these two civilizations, one ancient, one expanding, one disciplined, one ruthless, one shaped by mountains, one shaped by maritime conquest, was not a meeting. It was a collision foretold not by prophecy, but by geopolitics. Europe's hunger for metals, its alliances of kings and merchants, its doctrine of religious conquest, its centuries of maritime exploration. These forces moved the conquistadors more surely than wind filled their sails. When they landed on the South American coast, they did not ask who ruled this land. They asked only where the gold was. It was this question, this hunger, this blindness, that carried them inland like a swarm of locusts. And so, as Atahualpa drank chicha in the glow of victory, his empire whole in name, but shattered in body, the Spaniards climbed the Andes. They climbed with horses that ripped the earth with their hooves. They climbed with steel that caught the sun in cruel, foreign angles. They climbed with gunpowder, the sound of which seemed to tear the sky. They climbed with diseases that traveled ahead of them like scouts. But above all, they climbed with certainty. Certainty is its own kind of weapon. The Inca, for all their mastery of terrain, for all their architecture that defied earthquakes, for all their roads that embraced the mountains, lacked one thing: familiarity with the world beyond their own. They believed the Andes were the center of the human universe. They believed their empire was ordained by Inti, the sun, the highest deity. They believed any outsider would be just another tribe, another people who might resist, then yield, then be woven into the imperial tapestry. But the Spanish were not another thread. They were a tear. When the two worlds finally faced each other, the mountains seemed to inhale. The wind slowed. The air thinned more than usual, like the planet itself understood the magnitude of the moment. Atahualpa met the Spaniards not with fear, but with curiosity. And why wouldn't he? He commanded tens of thousands of soldiers. They numbered barely 200. He ruled an empire spanning deserts, jungles, highlands, and valleys. They were strangers struggling merely to breathe in the thin Andean air. His people built cities that could withstand earthquakes. The Spaniards lived in tents. The imbalance was so stark it seemed comical. But power is not measured only in numbers. Power is measured in asymmetry. The asymmetry was vast. Steel against bronze, horses against foot soldiers, gunpowder against stones, ruthlessness against ritual, knowledge of a wider world against knowledge contained within a single continent. And the deadliest asymmetry of all, a continent weakened by plague against an invading force already immune to the diseases it carried. The Inca saw strangers. The Spaniards saw prey. Atahualpa agreed to meet them at Cajamarca, riding in a litter lined with feathers and gold. He believed diplomacy would calm these foreigners. He believed display would impress them. He believed the encounter would end as all encounters with outsiders had ended, with the submission of the lesser and the incorporation of the willing. But the Spaniards interpreted his dignity as arrogance, his ceremony as vulnerability, his confidence as opportunity. Pizarro planned the ambush with the precision of a butcher. He studied the plaza. He calculated the angles. He positioned the cannons behind stone walls. He hid the cavalry in doorways and alleys. And when Atahualpa entered the square, unarmed and surrounded by attendants, carrying not weapons but authority, history pivoted. The Spanish priest stepped forward, offering a Bible, an object sacred to them, but unknown to the Inca. Atahualpa, confused by the foreign symbols, the alien language, the pressure of expectation, turned its pages and held it to his ear. Hearing nothing, he let it fall. To Pizarro and his men, this was blasphemy. To Atahualpa, it was simply an object that refused to speak. And in that instant, the trap was sprung. The cannons erupted, the horses charged, the blades flashed silver. The square turned into an execution ground. Thousands of Inca attendants died without understanding what was happening. They had never seen a horse before, never heard a firearm, never faced an enemy whose intention was not dominance, but annihilation. Atahualpa, the ruler of the largest empire the continent had ever known, was seized like a criminal. Pizarro held him aloft as proof that the Inca world was now his to carve. The Andes, which had witnessed the rise of countless civilizations, now witnessed the death of one. And this death did not unfold over generations. It unfolded in moments. But the true tragedy is this. The Inca did not fall because they were weak. They fell because the world had changed beyond their sight. They faced not enemies, but inevitabilities. The inevitability of global empires, the inevitability of maritime expansion, the inevitability of gunpowder and steel, the inevitability of diseases that traveled faster than armies, the inevitability of a collision between continents that had lived in isolation for millennia. The Spanish did not defeat the Inca because they were superior. They defeated them because the Inca had never been given the chance to prepare for a world that had already prepared for them. The Inca believed the empire would last forever. The Spanish believed empires existed only to be taken. Between these two convictions, history wrote one of its most brutal chapters. When Atahualpa was led away in chains, when the surviving attendants wept, when the mountains echoed with the roar of guns and the screams of the dying, a line was drawn across time. Before this moment, an empire of 4 directions, forged by stone, order, and sun. After this moment, a continent rewritten by forces it had never imagined. And so, the shadow that rose from the ocean fulfilled its purpose, not by strength, but by timing, not by righteousness, but by hunger, not by destiny, but by design. The end had arrived long before the Spaniards themselves. The plague had written the first chapter. Civil war had written the second. And now, steel would write the final one. When the dust settled on Cajamarca, the world was no longer divided into old and new. It was divided into before and after. The Inca had stood at the summit of the Andes. Now, they stood at the edge of extinction. And history moved on. Yet even as the smoke lifted from Cajamarca and the cries of the dying faded into the thin Andean air, the true magnitude of the moment had not yet revealed itself. The plaza held only bodies and silence, but history, invisible and merciless, had already shifted beneath the feet of both victors and vanquished. The Spaniards believed they had conquered an empire. In truth, they had only seized its king. They mistook Atahualpa's capture for dominion, unaware that what they held in chains was not the empire itself, but the last fragile thread holding it together. Atahualpa, though bound, did not tremble. He did not plead. He did not rage. Chroniclers would later write that he sat with the composure of a man who had already conversed with gods. Perhaps he believed this was a misunderstanding that would be resolved. Perhaps he believed these foreigners would negotiate, bargain, be satisfied with gifts. Perhaps he believed the world still obeyed the rules he had grown up with, but the world he knew had already collapsed, quietly, long before Pizarro ever crossed the ocean. Still, the Spaniards found themselves astonished. They had expected fear. They found dignity. They expected ignorance. They found intellect. They expected submission. They found a ruler who spoke with the calm weight of someone who believed the sun itself had placed him on earth. And in that calmness, they saw something that unsettled them more than any army could have: the unwavering belief of a man who did not yet realize his world was ending. What followed was a negotiation that was not truly a negotiation. Gold for freedom, they demanded. Gold beyond imagination. Gold not as tribute, but as ransom. Gold enough to fill a room from floor to ceiling. To the Spaniards, gold was wealth, power, salvation. To the Inca, gold was sunlight made solid, sacred, symbolic, never used as currency. But Atahualpa, trapped within a world whose logic was no longer his own, agreed, and the empire responded. Across the Andes, messengers ran with desperate urgency. Temples were stripped, statues dismantled, sacred artifacts melted. The sun's own metal, revered through centuries, was torn from sanctuaries to pay for the life of one man. It was a sacrifice, not of submission, but of love. Love for the Sapa Inca. Love for the idea of unity. Love for a world that still believed it could be repaired. And as the gold arrived, piece by piece, idol by idol, the Spaniards stared in disbelief. They had dreamed of wealth. They had not dreamed of this. They had not imagined an empire where gold decorated walls the way paint decorated churches. They had not imagined artisans who shaped sunlight with the delicacy of poets shaping verses. They had not imagined a civilization where the sacred was everywhere, where beauty was a language inscribed into stone, metal, and ritual. But even as the gold piled higher, as Pizarro's greed deepened, as his men argued over the division of a fortune without equal, the end was already sealed. For greed is not satisfied by ransom, it is inflamed by it. And the Spaniards, who had come seeking riches, now understood that killing the Inca emperor might give them more riches still. Atahualpa began to understand, perhaps too late, that he was not negotiating with men who saw him as human. He was negotiating with men who saw the world as a ledger and its people as entries in a profit column. His dignity no longer protected him. His empire no longer shielded him. His gold no longer ensured his safety. When the moment came, swift, brutal, inevitable, the mountains seemed to recoil. A civilization that had risen without writing, conquered without iron, engineered without wheels, and endured without collapse for centuries, was brought to its knees not by superior might, but by a handful of men who mistook destruction for destiny. And in the silence that followed, in the darkness that fell over the Andes, one truth remained. An empire does not fall when its walls crumble. It falls when its story is taken from it. And the Inca story, luminous and vast, was slipping into the shadows, even as the stones of Machu Picchu continued to drink the morning sun, unaware that their world no longer belonged to the people who raised them.